Hello, everyone, and welcome to the Make Your Own Noise podcast. My name is Jack Negro, and thank you for joining me today. Today's podcast is avoiding burnout and taking time off without guilt. I thought this was a fitting final podcast for the year as we enter the holiday season. And this has definitely been something for me I have struggled with for a very long time, especially the part about taking time off without feelings of guilt. As I've said before, working for yourself, owning your own business, we set our own expectations. There's always something to do. And I would always find I would really struggle to take time off without feeling guilty. And even when I was taking that time off, I was unsettled because of that. So in today's podcast, we're going to go through why do we feel guilty when we do take time off? We're going to go through signs of burnout and how to avoid it. We're going to talk about burnout versus laziness and how to know the difference. We are going to talk a little bit about the art of rest and how to do it well. And a final point we're going to talk about is viewing rest as productive. That was a huge change for me in my psychology and attitude towards time and rest. And I really hope you get something from that too. So let's first start with, why do many of us feel guilty about taking time off? This has been a huge issue for me over the past 12 years. As I said, working as a freelance music producer, it's still something I struggle with a lot, if I'm honest, but I've improved a lot in this space over recent years through self-reflection, seeing a life coach, psychologist too, to really dive into why I do have those feelings of guilt, because no matter how much I did, there was always something I felt like I could be doing for the business. I could always be doing more. It was never good enough. I'd be at social events with friends, families, partners, and in the back of my mind, the to-do list on my calendar was there, reminding me of the workload ahead and things I need to get done. And, this would lead me to feeling quite unpresent, even overwhelmed at times. And it did take me some time to get better at this, and even took some significant life moments for me to realize there are more important things than my career and business, as much as I love it. And I think that is a really important point to repeat, that although I love my career and my art, and it's incredibly important to me, there are other things in life of equal or more importance. I guess that is a bit of a heavy way to start this podcast, and something, might normally save to the end, but I feel it helps set the tone for the importance of learning to rest and avoiding burnout, and it gives you some context to my struggles with it as well. So what are some of the reasons why we do feel guilty about taking time off? We don't feel guilty because our to-do list isn't empty and we got everything done. There's always, when you own your own business, there's always something that probably needs to be done. That will always be the case. We feel guilty because of some much deeper rooted and personal themes. And I have felt that I tend to feel guilty for taking time off through more feelings of low self-worth and self-doubt. And the other reason tends to be fear and lack of security. So I'm just going to repeat those 2 points because that is what I'm going to dive into now. The two main reasons I feel that, well, personally anyway, that I have felt guilty for taking time off. The first point being low self-worth and self-doubt, and the second being fear and lack of security. These are the reasons we tend to feel guilty for taking time off. I do understand in some circumstances we feel guilty because we've just genuinely been lazy, and we know we could have done more or done better. And I will talk about that shortly and how to maybe tell the difference. But for now, let's assume, for us in the creative space, we often love our jobs. We're very passionate about our jobs, and that is more likely to lead to burnout than laziness. And the burnout will tend to come because of lack of time off far more frequently than laziness. So let's look into these two themes that I just listed: low self-worth and self-doubt, and fear of lack of security. For low self-worth and self-doubt, we can feel guilty at times for taking time off because we don't feel we've earned it. This is often directly linked to feelings of low self-worth. If we don't think highly of ourselves, then clearly we will not feel like we've earned anything. A personal challenge for me for a long time was I often didn't think I was actually all that good at what I do, or I got lucky or fluked the position and bands I got to work with. And I guess you'd call this a very heavy-handed, version of imposter syndrome, hence why it was one of the first episodes I ever did. So to counteract those feelings of not actually feeling good enough for the position I found myself in, or that to cover the fact that maybe I wasn't that good at what I do, I thought through outworking others, I could get ahead and be successful. So by taking time off, it felt counterproductive to that, and that if I didn't work really hard and outwork everyone, that they'll be better than me. I guess another deeper question here then is, why was it so important for me to feel, or for any of us to be successful? Like, why was that such a fear and important thing? And often for people with low self-worth, being successful is a way that they can build their self-worth. Yet so often this isn't the answer. As soon as you place your self-worth on an external success, such as your career or business, you've left yourself in a very vulnerable point. And it's a mistake I've made before. I feel, now building your self-worth on things you can control, because a lot of things in your business you can't always control, especially successes and accolades are not in your control a lot of the time. But yeah, build your self-worth around things you can control. How you treat others, how you act even when no one is watching, sticking to your word, treating others professionally and out of your work context with kindness, regardless of status or any external successes you've achieved or not. So yes, I think low self-worth and self-doubt is definitely one of the main reasons we tend to feel guilty for taking time off. If we do feel low self-worth, we probably don't feel like we've earned it. And if we have any self-doubt over our craft, or that we're actually good at what we do, we often feel like if we take time off, we're going to fall further behind, or we're going to be found out. So we've got to work really hard to make sure we outwork everyone to stay ahead. So another reason we often feel guilty about taking time off is through fear and lack of security, and that we're actually scared to take time off. This one's very personal to me, and some may relate, and others might be sitting there thinking I'm absolutely crazy. But sometimes I could be afraid to take time off because I genuinely didn't know how I wanted to spend my time. And like I said, for some of you listening, you might be able to relate, and others might not have a clue what I'm talking about. But if you do relate, I'd love to hear back from you. But I actually didn't know how I would enjoy spending my time, what I would do. I was so used to working and progressing and striving that I was too scared to sit still or not exactly know what I was going to do next, not be achieving. And I guess that ties back to that feeling of low self-worth, that if I wasn't achieving or progressing my business or something else, I wasn't moving forward, and that I didn't have enough self-worth without that. And I guess that's a bit of a deeper thing to talk about another time maybe. But just thought I would share a bit of that insight with my struggles with it. But a far more obvious fear in the creative industries is we do have a lack of security. And I've said it many a times, for established and aspiring creative professionals, we often work for ourselves. This alone is a very vulnerable feeling, and I have spoken about that a little bit before. But you add to that, not only do we work for ourselves, we work in industries that are quite turbulent. They're quite cyclical in nature as well. We're not even talking about, we've had pandemics and there's looming economic challenges that are ahead or current. No wonder we feel a lack of security. So, for me, I would constantly tell myself, take the work while it's there. I'm usually booked out a few months in advance. So if there's nothing after that, but more work's coming in that wants to be in the next few months, I'd fit it in where I really shouldn't have, and work because I don't know what's ahead. I don't have a booking 4 or 5 months ahead, so I better double down and take it while it's there. And I tell myself these stories to justify overworking, which led to burnout, which I'm going to talk more about shortly, and moments of burnout. But the thing here is that we need to recognize our need for security is an absolute fundamental need that runs very deep into our subconscious. If we feel just an ever so slight feeling of insecurity around our financial position or our career, which as a freelance professional is almost always, we will struggle to take time off without feelings of unease or guilt. So I guess just like the imposter syndrome episode, the recognition of this alone, that this is a threat detection system ingrained in us, is a big starting point to helping relieve those feelings of guilt. The other obvious way is obviously to have more money or systems aside and safety nets, so you do feel more secure. But I think that is a different topic we can dive into another time. So the next section I want to talk about in this podcast is signs of burnout and how to avoid it. For me, I first noticed burnout when there were moments where I didn't want to be in the studio, which sounds crazy because I love it. And for most of the time, could not wait to be mixing and be in the studio with a great band. But I do remember some moments where I'd have a great band coming in and I was excited, but there was just this part of me that was like, oh, if it could just be tomorrow, I just need one day to reset or this or that. And that was a pretty clear sign that something wasn't right for me. Probably wasn't even overly aware of burnout by this point. It actually happened, I guess for anyone that knows me personally, it more happened around the time when I had a studio down in Sydney and I was traveling from the Central Coast. And I know some people do this every day. I guess I was in the eastern suburbs, so I'd be traveling. It was about with no traffic, it was an hour and a half, but often 2 hours in the morning, close to an hour and a half home. And I was doing a 10-hour day with the band. Plus, I'd want to be there at least half an hour, if not 45 minutes earlier to set up, clean, make sure everything's good. So, it's 11-ish hours for me in the studio if we didn't run overtime, which would happen, plus the travel, door to door. These were 14, 15-hour days. I did this for about 2 years. That was the point I really noticed it when I was really struggling to get myself motivated to get down there. Hence the change where I either had to move down there or relocate and built Sonora Studios. So I guess just that's a little personal insight to it. So let's talk about some signs of burnout and how to avoid it. Just to start here, the best way to avoid it is obviously through rest and recovery, which I'm going to talk a bit more about shortly. But if we can learn to recognize these signs, the earlier we recognize it, we can figure out, oh, something's not right here. I'm noticing these signs. What do I need to do to alleviate this from happening or progressing to a big blown burnout? So some of these signs that I have found linked to burnout are, the first one is, like I just said, not excited by the job that you normally love or not wanting to go into work. Now, fortunately for you listening out there that are doing this full time or aspire to do this full time, I can even say, I've talked about burnout a lot in this podcast and my struggles with it. I can wholeheartedly say that 90% of the last 12 years of my working life, I have never not wanted to go into work. 90% of the time, I'm excited, I'm feeling good about it, and off I go. I've had other jobs in the past before I started this where I really didn't want to go in. And unfortunately, some people, work for decades with that. But yeah, for us as creative professionals working with art and things we love, this really shouldn't be the case. So if we are noticing that we are not excited by our job anymore and we're really not wanting to go into work, huge sign of some burnout. Another one, this is a more subtle one, but a lack of patience. Lack of patience is a funny one I would notice, and I would argue I am a very patient person in the studio and have had many people tell me I am, and hope any, I guess, of the artists I work with listen, agree. But sometimes internally, the studio is a place for calmness. It's a place where you need time and space to feel creative, which I've referenced in other podcasts before. And if I was burnt out and my workload was increasing, subtly inside me, I would just notice if it was taking longer to get a take or taking longer to pull a tone or taking longer to set up. I could just notice a bit of a lack of patience building inside me. Definitely a sign of burnout. When I've got a good schedule, I've recovered well, I'm definitely so much more patient in the studio, and not just for a recording studio. For anyone wanting to be creative, which is probably most people listening to this podcast, you must be patient to let that process unfold. It does not happen in the blink of an eye a lot of the time. So that's a really subtle one, but something to be aware of if you're feeling a bit patient and irritated as well. Another sign for burnout is little things are getting missed or multiple mistakes are building up. There was a point for me when I was working full-time at the Grove Studios, which I was there for a long time, and I was also freelancing as well. So, I essentially had 2 full-time jobs almost by this point, and I was teaching a bit, and I just kept missing little mistakes. And I felt like I was doing 2 full-time jobs at 70%. And I was making these little mistakes, and I didn't know how I was missing it. And that was the point where I started to realize I can't sustain both, and I ended up moving to become freelance. But yeah, if you are constantly missing little things, we're all human, we make mistakes, but if it's constantly happening and they're not things you normally miss and it's building up, definitely a sign of some burnout as well. Another sign of burnout I also find is lack of sustained focus. And this differentiates from being lazy, which is what I'm about to talk about next. But a lack of sustained focus, when you are burnt out, if anyone here has experienced burnout, it's like you cannot control or collect your thoughts together and focus on something. It's like if you tried to read something and words are just bouncing off the page or it's not sinking in. Or for me in the studio, it was like I'd have to get the drummer to repeat something 4 times till I got the kick pattern locked in my head. Or when I'm feeling sharp and I'm not burnt out, I'm remembering those things quickly. I'm remembering what I was thinking about halfway through a take to say at the end. So those little signs, that lack of sustained focus, is definitely another sign of burnout. So the last point I want to talk about, and one of the biggest signs of burnout, is outside of your work, if you are lacking energy or motivation to want to do anything else, like your other hobbies, seeing your friends, family, or other activities, to me, this is the key sign that you are burnt out. We should want to have the motivation to enjoy those things outside of our careers. Don't get me wrong, there's nothing wrong with needing some downtime in your own space after some big work days to recharge. Absolutely, I'm all for complete rest and quiet. But if you find yourself regularly not having the energy or motivation to be able to engage in anything outside of your career, and you find yourself constantly just needing rest, downtime, doing very little, this is a significant sign that you are likely burnt out. And I would really argue the biggest sign and the most relatable for many people. So if anything I said in that last bit is resonating with you, definitely a sign of some burnout, because you should really feel motivated and energized to be able to enjoy those things. Another point I wanted to talk about in this podcast just for a moment is the difference between burnout and laziness. There is a distinct difference between the two, and knowing these differences is important. We don't want our internal critique to keep telling us that we're just being lazy and keep pushing ourselves into overworking. But on the flip side, we also don't want to tell ourselves we are burning out when really we're just being lazy. So what are some of the key differences between burnout and laziness? One of the big ones I find is withdrawal from others. When you are burnt out, it is so hard for you to even muster up the mental capacity or physical capacity to want to engage with others. And that is definitely a sign of burnout. In your time off, you should be able to have the energy to see family or friends. It doesn't mean you have to be the most social person. And I'm all for recharging in your own space and needing to have down and still time alone as well. But if you are constantly finding that you're just pulling away from social events or calling your friend or a family member back because you just don't have the mental capacity and you're too frazzled after a big week of work and I just can't do it, definitely a sign of burnout. And that is where I feel like burnout differs from laziness. While with laziness, you're still spending time with family and friends to avoid work. And I just want to make a clear point for a second also that spending time with family and friends, etc., is incredibly important. It doesn't mean you're being lazy. It's more to do with the point of if you constantly cannot summon up enough physical or mental capacity to engage with others, that's the sign of burnout over you just being lazy and doing lots of social events to avoid work. Another point of the difference between burnout and laziness, going on from what I just said, is physical exhaustion. The difference between burnout and laziness, when you are burnt out, you can't do something. It feels too physically demanding to do it. Versus when you're lazy, you are choosing to not do something. So let's just say you're on a project or you're working on something in a professional context and it just feels too hard to do. You feel too heavy and it feels too hard. That is burnout. Opposed to you choose not to do it over maybe doing something else or watching Netflix or seeing your friends or doing anything to procrastinate. That is the difference. So you can't do something versus you choose not to do something. And the last point to help understand the difference between burnout and stress is, do you have chronic stress or do you have lack of motivation without stress? If you are burnt out, you are feeling chronically stressed in maybe a lot of different areas of your life it's sort of creeping into. While if you're just being lazy and you're being honest with yourself here, you're lacking motivation without stress. So if you're just finding harder to get out of bed, or you can't concentrate for long, or you're not finishing your projects, but really you're actually, if you're really honest with yourself, you're not under much external stress, that's a sign you're being lazy. While if you are chronically stressed all the time and you genuinely know there are external things and deadlines and your calendar and financial pressures or performance standards to meet, that chronic stress, you feel that. And that is burnout. Opposed to, as I said, just to repeat myself, laziness is more you're lacking motivation, but really there actually is nothing externally stressing you out. That is probably the main point between burnout and laziness. Hopefully those above points can help you gauge if you are actually burnt out or maybe you're just being a little bit lazy. A final point for this section too is, don't be hard on yourself if you swing back and forth a bit between stages of burnout and moments of laziness. We are human. We all have a unique balance of our own to find, of workload, social life preferences, external life circumstances playing their part too. We are often self-directed professionals working for ourselves, and we need to experiment with these different balances, routines, and systems to find what works for us. If you find yourself seeing the signs of burnout regularly, then pull back a little bit from work. If you find you're falling behind on your work, but you were able to have a few big Friday and Saturday nights, maybe it's time you pull up your socks and stop being a little bit lazy and crack back into some work. Play with it, experiment, constantly be self-aware to check in on yourself and how you are feeling. If you are feeling reasonably motivated and happy both in your professional and personal life a majority of the time, then that's a great sign that you have found a good balance. So the next part of this podcast I want to talk about is the art of rest. And it is funny I'm talking about this because I'm recording this podcast on a Sunday as we speak. And I remember talking to my dear mother about this podcast episode idea, and she thought it was quite funny because at times I have struggled to learn to rest. But I've definitely gotten a lot better at that, and have really noticed significant changes in my life and in all areas and my happiness because of that. But hopefully by this point now, we have come to understand why, and that we shouldn't feel guilty about taking the time off. That was the big one I was struggling with, because we can recognize the signs of burnout and know we aren't just being lazy. I wanted to briefly share now a few things that have worked for me effectively to rest, and everyone will have a different work-life balance that works for them and have different things to replenish them. I don't want to preach what anyone should or shouldn't do in their spare time. I just wanted to share some of the things that have personally worked for me. I think quite a few of these are universal, but I found a balance of spending time with family and friends, along with time alone in my own space, incredibly important. We are social beings. We need to interact with other people we know well. It's really important for our health. But at the same time, if you're in a work environment that is around a lot of people, there are a lot of benefits and importance in being comfortable in your own space to recharge too. Everyone is different here, and there's no quantifiable number of hours you should be spending alone or with people you know. I found during weeks where I'm recording bands or I'm teaching more, where I'm heavily engaged with other people, and that is a lot of external energy, I need to spend more time alone in my own space to recenter. Whereas for weeks where I'm alone mixing by myself, I will make a conscious effort to, line up dinners with friends or go for a run with a mate or something with people after work to balance that out. And there was just something that popped into my head I just want to talk about off that, which ties in earlier, is there's nothing wrong with wanting to spend time in your own space. It's incredibly important, like I've said. When you have that downtime, if you do not have the energy or motivation to do the things you enjoy in your own space, that is definitely a sign of burnout. So by all means, if you want to spend a lot of your downtime, in your own space, that is absolutely fine. And actually a very sign of a healthy, mental space. If you are not enjoying the things you would normally enjoy or have the energy or motivation to do it, that is definitely still a sign of burnout. Exercise is obviously another thing I know I constantly preach. You don't have to run marathons, but a nice walk outside or a quick dip in the ocean are some great things that I find revitalize me. And I also don't want to be that guy, but be mindful of your screen time on your phone and streaming services. I get it. Sometimes you just need to zone out to something mind numbing. But if you feel like you need that quite a bit, I will now say we can both agree that is a sign you are likely burnt out. My phone can definitely be an issue for me, and I find when I'm a little bit stressed or tired or burnt out, I crave that simple dopamine fix it gives me by being on it more than I should, and I do find it harder to put down. And I notice when I'm in those stages where I just can't get off the screen. But if I can tear myself away from it and learn to just sit and be still and not distracted or so highly stimulated, it is a much quicker way for me to become more present and rebalance. That is probably a key thing to mention one more time. If we are burnt out, it is fair to say that we are overstimulated. So in our rest time, if we are latched to our screens and streaming services, we are still further stimulating ourselves. Put the phone down and go for a 15-minute walk. Leave the phone in your car and go down to the beach for a quick dip. Put the phone on airplane mode before you go to bed and read a page or two of a book or have a longer shower or tidy your room. But just learn to spend time being slow and unstimulated. So, final point I wanted to talk about today is learning to view rest as productive. This thought stemmed from something quite personal for me where I have this messed up relationship with time where I see every moment as needing to be doing something. If I finish with a band early or something cancelled or I unexpectedly had some free time that opened up, my first reaction was, how can I spend this time to do something more productive? How can I use this time? This kind of came down to the fear that, God forbid, I don't use my time productively, and this now reflects on my self-worth. But I did learn over time and through many mistakes and many burnouts and talking to a life coach and close friends too, to start viewing rest as productive. If I do learn to properly rest and have a good balance, I will actually be more productive whilst I'm working. For example, say in the past, I used to work, say, 70 to 80 hours a week, and I would deliver 100 units of output. Now I work probably 60 hours a week and deliver 95 units of output. So I've dropped 10 hours a week from my working week, yet I've only dropped off 5% of the output, yet I'm happier, I'm more balanced, I have more motivation whilst at work and more motivation energy to enjoy my time off, and I've barely dropped any output in my productivity, and the quality is probably better. So yeah, you don't want to be stuck in this bad middle ground of working a lot, but you're so stressed and burnt out that your productivity output is actually quite poor and the quality is probably quite poor too. And you've got no energy to enjoy your time off anyway. You may find just by stepping back a little bit, your output might barely decrease and the productivity will grow way up. And as I said, your energy levels and motivation come surging back to enjoy both your work and your art and the time off you're having. And that is the balance and place you want to find yourself in. And you will know when you're there. Everything will be flowing better and your motivation and energy, to use those words again, will be stemming into all areas of your life. But if you ever find yourself in that weird middle ground where you're working, but you're actually not being that productive, as I said again, just try stepping back that little bit and just see what happens, because I was so scared to do that. And as soon as I did, just take a half day off on a Sunday. God, I felt better on the Monday for it. And I actually noticed I had such more sustained focus at work. And the quality was way better as a result too. And arguably, I'm probably giving the exact same amount of output of productivity anyway. But as I've said in this podcast a few times today, everyone's balances are very different and unique to them. The way we rest and what we want to do in our time off is very different to each person. The way we recover is very unique to each person too. And as we go through life, our own unique balances will change over time too, as circumstances change. But I hope from this podcast today, you can take away that there are some universal signs of burnout that are not healthy. And we now understand why we sometimes can feel guilty about taking time off, and that we shouldn't feel this way, because we do see rest as productive. We know the difference of taking healthy time off or if we're just being lazy. And we understand that if we get our balance right, our professional lives will benefit, our personal lives will benefit, we'll be happier, healthier, motivated, and more energized. I hope with this Christmas break coming ahead, if you're listening to this, near the release, that you do have a fantastic time off and that you replenish and revitalize and hit a fantastic 2025 with a huge amount of focus and motivation and energy. Thank you so much for listening. We'll be back in January with some new episodes. I really hope you have an amazing holidays. Thank you so much for your time and listening to these first episodes. I'm really looking forward to a huge 2025. Please, message, like, share, subscribe. I love hearing from anyone that is resonating or wants to challenge anything I'm saying too. It helps me grow. Have a great Christmas holidays. Thank you again.